At 5:42 in the morning, Vivian Marsh cut the padlock off my workshop door with bolt cutters she'd brought from home. She stepped inside like she owned the place. She didn't. The moment that door closed behind her, my security system quietly sealed the interior release. I was 10 minutes away, coffee in hand, watching it happen live on my phone. I didn't call anyone. I didn't rush back. I just turned up the screen brightness. Some people dig their own grave. I just made sure nothing interrupted her. My name is Danielle Hart. Before Maple Hollow, before the workshop, before any of this, I spent 19 years as a firefighter on a ladder company. That kind of work teaches you one thing above all else. You don't act on incomplete information. You read the building. You read the smoke. You wait for the right moment. Then you move with everything you have. I retired 3 years ago with 2 replaced knees, a hearing aid in my left ear, and a clear sense of what I wanted to do with the time I had left. I converted my detached barn into a free repair workshop. Every Saturday, disabled veterans and low-income seniors came from as far as 40 miles out. They brought broken wheelchairs, bent walkers, cracked ramps, mobility scooters with dead batteries. We fixed everything for free. Parts came from donations, from salvage, from suppliers who'd quietly been giving us discounts because they believed in what we were doing. The rhythm never changed. 7 in the morning, the coffee was on. By 8, the first vehicles rolled into the gravel lot. By noon, we'd usually finished 4 or 5 repairs. The smell in there was always the same: machine oil, sawdust, the faint bite of solder, and whatever someone had brought in a foil-covered dish, because nobody ever showed up empty-handed. I kept records the way I'd kept incident logs on the job, dated, methodical. Every visitor signed in. Every repair had a job sheet. Not because I expected trouble, but because documentation was the difference between a report that held up and one that didn't. Most of the neighborhood understood what we were doing, but some people look at a thing like that and don't see what it is. They see what it costs them: a parking spot, an aesthetic, a sense of control slipping away. Vivian Marsh was that kind of person. I just didn't know yet how far she was willing to go. The first complaint came 8 weeks after we opened: parking. Vivian claimed my visitors were blocking the street. I checked. They weren't. The vehicles closest to the curb were inside the legal zone by at least 4 feet. I took photographs with timestamps and filed them in a folder on my desktop, labeled simply Marsh. I didn't think much of it. Neighbors complain. It happens. The second complaint came 3 weeks later: noise. She claimed the workshop generated commercial-level sound on Saturday mornings. The county sent an inspector. He stood outside for 12 minutes with a decibel meter and left without issuing anything. His report noted activity consistent with light residential hobbyist use. That went into the folder too. Third complaint: debris. She claimed tools and parts were being left on the street. I walked the block myself within the hour. Nothing there. I photographed it anyway. Folder. At that point, I had 3 complaints, 3 non-findings, and 11 documents, and I still thought it might stop. It was the 4th complaint that changed my reading of the situation. She filed with the county assessor's office, claiming I was running an unlicensed commercial repair business subject to business tax and zoning review. That filing required a written statement describing the alleged operation. I obtained a copy through a public records request. The statement contained details that weren't possible to observe from the street. She described the interior layout. She mentioned the number of workbenches. She referenced a parts cabinet near the east wall, visible only from inside the barn or through a side window facing my property, not the road. She had been on my land without permission, more than once, almost certainly, and used what she saw to build a formal complaint with a government office. That was the moment I stopped seeing individual grievances and started seeing a pattern. This wasn't a neighbor who was annoyed. This was a deliberate, escalating campaign, careful enough to stay below the line of obvious harassment, but consistent enough that the shape of it became unmistakable once you laid the pieces side by side. I opened a second document that night. I called it Timeline. Every date, every complaint number, every inspector visit, every public statement. I started cross-referencing her filings against information she shouldn't have had access to. There was a moment, one specific moment, where this could have ended quietly. It was a Tuesday evening in early October, about 4 months into the campaign. I was pulling into my driveway when Vivian appeared at the edge of my property line, not on it, right at the edge, the way people do when they want to make a point about where the line is. She was holding a printed document, the posture of someone who'd rehearsed what she wanted to say. I got out of the truck. I waited. She told me the HOA board had reviewed my operation and determined it was inconsistent with the community's residential character. She said it exactly like that, reading from a script she'd written to sound official. She said the board was formally requesting I cease operations by the 1st of November or face escalating enforcement. I asked if the full board had voted or if this was her own determination. She said that was an internal matter. I told her calmly that I had 3 years of documented compliance, 3 inspector visits that found nothing, and a program serving disabled veterans and elderly residents free of charge. Then I said one more thing. Vivian, I'm going to give you one piece of advice. Whatever you're planning to do next, make sure you have the authority to do it. Because once you take an action you're not authorized to take, this stops being a neighborhood disagreement and becomes something else entirely. She looked at me like I'd spoken a language she didn't know. I have full authority over HOA matters in this community, she said. I don't need your advice. She turned and walked back toward her house. I went inside, opened my laptop, and wrote down her exact words while they were still fresh. I have full authority over HOA matters in this community. I saved the file. That sentence was going to matter later. I already knew it. After that night, Vivian stopped trying to talk to me directly. That told me something. People with legitimate authority don't go quiet when challenged. They produce documentation, cite the bylaw, call the meeting. Vivian went quiet because she'd realized she didn't have the specifics I was asking for. So she changed tactics. Instead of confronting me, she started working the neighborhood. The week after that conversation, I made 3 calls. The first was to the county zoning office, asking them to walk me through the exact classification of my property. They emailed me the code sections into the folder. The second was to a property rights attorney named Diane Foster. I paid for a 1-hour consultation and asked her to review everything I had. She read through it, asked 4 questions, and told me that every complaint Vivian had filed was either factually unsupported or jurisdictionally misaligned. She also told me something I hadn't asked about, that if an HOA officer was filing formal complaints based on information gathered through unauthorized access to private property, that was significant legal exposure. Civil and potentially criminal, she said, depending on how the access looked and how the information was used. The third call was to a security contractor. I told him I wanted full exterior coverage, every approach, every door, every window with a sightline to the property. Motion-triggered recording, automatic cloud backup, a 30-day retention window. He came out that Thursday. By Saturday, the workshop had 9 cameras. I didn't post a notice. In Colorado, visible security cameras on private property require no public disclosure. 2 weeks after the cameras went up, Vivian made her first public move. Not an official HOA meeting, those had procedures, minutes, votes that had to be filed. This was informal, held at the home of a board member named Richard Doyle, who'd sat on the HOA board for 11 years without ever once running contested. I wasn't invited. A neighbor named Nora told me about it the next morning over the fence. Vivian had presented a printed packet, photographs, complaint records, county correspondence, arguing the workshop was a liability to the neighborhood's property values. Nora said at least 2 of the photographs had clearly been taken from inside my property line. One showed the workshop's interior through the side window. Another showed the gravel path at an angle only achievable from inside my own yard. She had trespassed, documented it, and used the photographs in a formal presentation to my neighbors. I wrote it all down that morning, Nora's account, the date, the photographs as she remembered them. I asked if she'd be willing to put it in writing someday. She said yes without hesitating. I added her name to the timeline. The official HOA meeting was the 3rd Thursday of November. 43 residents attended, more than double the usual turnout. Word had gotten around that something was happening with the workshop, and people came the way people come to things they've been hearing about secondhand for weeks. I sat in the 3rd row with nothing but my phone and a small notebook. Vivian ran the meeting from a podium at the front of the community center, dressed formally, printed agenda in hand, a wireless clicker loaded with a presentation. She wanted it to look official, because official-looking things are harder to argue with in a room full of people who haven't read the underlying documents. She moved through the agenda quickly until she reached item 4. Then she stopped, looked up at the room, and said, with the measured gravity of someone who'd been waiting months to say this out loud, "I want to address the situation with the Hart property. I have conducted an extensive review, and I am prepared to state on the record that it constitutes an unauthorized commercial enterprise. I intend to file a formal cease and desist through the association's legal counsel, and I will be personally gathering evidence sufficient to refer this matter to the county for enforcement action." The room went quiet. Then she said the part I'd been waiting for. "I don't need Ms. Hart's cooperation to do this. I don't need her permission to document what's happening on that property, and I don't need this board's approval to act in the best interest of this community." She clicked to the next slide. I wrote down every word in my notebook, then checked the timestamp on my phone. 7:44 p.m. She had just announced, in front of 43 witnesses, that she intended to gather evidence on my property without my permission and without board authorization. She said it like a declaration of strength. I heard it as a confession in advance. Within 2 weeks of that meeting, Vivian had pulled 3 other people into her campaign. Richard Doyle sent a formal letter on HOA stationery to the county zoning department, co-signed with Vivian, citing specific interior dimensions of the workshop, measurements not in any public record, impossible to obtain without entering the property. I submitted a records request for the letter the next day. The second was a contractor called Harlan Compliance Group, a property compliance firm Vivian had used before. She hired them without a board vote, without a line item in the budget, without any documented authorization. 2 men in a white truck drove slowly past the workshop 3 Saturdays in a row, photographing from the street. On the 4th Saturday, one of them walked up my driveway. My camera caught him at 8:17 a.m., standing at the edge of the gravel path, photographing the side entrance and the equipment visible through the open barn door. He never knocked, never identified himself, never asked permission. It was all on video, time-stamped. I called Diane that afternoon. She confirmed that a contractor accessing private property without owner consent, absent a court order or a specific bylaw granting inspection rights, neither of which existed here, was actionable trespass. If the contractor's findings were used to support a formal complaint, the tainted evidence problem ran upstream to whoever had authorized the access. "It means whoever signed the authorization," she said, when I asked if that meant Vivian personally. The third recruit was a board member named Carol Simmons, who emailed the full HOA membership, all 87 households, describing the workshop as a precedent zoning concern and asking residents to report any observations directly to the board. The email went out on a Tuesday night. By Wednesday morning, 3 residents had forwarded it to me. I saved every copy, noted the send time, and confirmed no board vote had ever authorized the communication. Vivian thought she was assembling a case. She was assembling a liability. The county compliance office sent a formal notice on December 14th, not a citation, a request for information, one step below enforcement. I had 30 days to submit documentation demonstrating compliance. I sat with that number for a while. The folder had 68 documents. The timeline had 31 entries. What I didn't have yet was the thing I'd been waiting for since October, something Vivian did herself, alone, that required no interpretation and left no room for a procedural defense. I called Diane that evening. She told me I could file for a 15-day extension based on document preparation. "That buys you time without triggering escalation," she said. "But Danielle, if you're waiting for something specific, you need it to happen in that window." I filed the extension the next morning. Then I did something I'd been turning over in my mind for 2 weeks. I mentioned, casually, to 3 different neighbors on 3 separate days that I'd be driving to Denver the weekend after Christmas, staying with a friend. The workshop would be closed. I said it without emphasis, the way you say things you don't mind people knowing. Word moved through Maple Hollow the way it always did. I packed a bag Friday evening, drove to my brother's cabin 10 minutes away, and set every camera to motion-activated recording with real-time alerts to my phone. Then I waited. She moved on the second day. Saturday morning, 5:42 a.m. My phone buzzed on the nightstand. Motion detected, Zone 4. I opened the app. The image was sharp, the timestamp clean. There was Vivian Marsh, dark clothing, flashlight in one hand, bolt cutters in the other. She moved with purpose. She'd planned this. She went straight to the side entrance, knelt, and worked through the padlock's shackle in 2 attempts. The crack of the metal came through clearly on the camera's audio. The lock dropped into the gravel. She stepped inside. The door closed behind her. What Vivian didn't know was that 2 years earlier, after a string of equipment thefts, I'd installed a containment protocol, a secondary interior lock that activated automatically whenever forced entry through that door was detected. The door could still be opened from outside with a key. From inside, the release stayed disabled until a reset code was entered, or law enforcement arrived and manually overrode it. The system had been inspected and approved by the Maple Hollow Sheriff's Department when it was installed. I had the documentation in the folder. I watched the next 4 minutes without moving. She tried the handle, tried again, put her shoulder into the door, swept her flashlight across the walls, searching for another way out. She found the reset panel and couldn't open it. She tried the main barn doors, but those were secured with a separate deadbolt I locked every Saturday night out of habit. They opened 3 inches and caught on the exterior hasp. She could see daylight through the gap. She couldn't get through it. That was when the panic started. She kicked the side door once, twice. She hit the reset panel with the heel of her palm. Then she screamed. Not words, just sound. A single burst of pure frustration, the microphone caught with total clarity. She dialed 911, raised the phone to her ear, opened her mouth, and hung up. She stood there, breathing in the beam of her own flashlight, working through it. She was in a locked building she'd entered by force, holding bolt cutters she'd brought from home, with no authorization, no board vote, no court order. Calling for help meant deputies arriving and finding exactly that. For about 90 seconds, she tried to find a third option. There wasn't one. What she did instead, and the cameras caught every second of it, was start destroying things. She swept a shelf of hardware bins onto the floor. She kicked over a rolling tool cart. She grabbed the Saturday sign-in sheet, 17 names on it, and tore it in half. She pulled the cord on an extension light and swung it into the wall hard enough to shatter the housing. 12 separate acts of vandalism in 4 minutes and 19 seconds. Then she stopped, standing in the middle of the wreckage she'd made, and called 911 again. This time, she didn't hang up. I was already on the phone with the sheriff's non-emergency line from my brother's cabin. I told the deputy my name, my address, and that I had a confirmed intruder locked inside my workshop following a forced entry, fully captured on camera with audio and video from the moment of entry. I told him she'd likely call in a distress call from the same location any moment. "Stay where you are," he said. "We're sending a unit now." I set the phone down and looked out at the pre-dawn dark over the Colorado foothills. 6 months, 68 documents, 31 timeline entries, 9 cameras. She had finished building the case herself. I drove back to Maple Hollow, but on that drive, I wasn't thinking about Vivian. I wasn't thinking about the footage or the charges already forming like a checklist in the back of my mind. I was thinking about Marcus Reed. Specifically, I was thinking about an afternoon 3 months earlier when he'd pulled me aside after a Saturday session and told me, quietly, that a woman he didn't know had approached him in the parking lot the week before. She'd asked how often he came to the workshop, whether he paid for anything, whether he'd ever signed a service agreement. She'd been friendly about it, conversational. Marcus had answered her questions, polite the way he always was. He didn't know who she was or what she was building. He told me about it only because something had felt off. "It felt like being interviewed by someone who wasn't saying why," he said. I wrote it down, added it to the timeline, told him to let me know if she approached him again. She never did, but I thought about that conversation a lot in the weeks that followed. Not the legal exposure, not the evidence value, the simple wrongness of it,
A woman in a parking lot quietly extracting information from a disabled veteran who'd driven 41 miles to get his wheelchair fixed for free, with no idea he was being used as raw material for someone else's case. Marcus had served 2 tours. He'd lost the use of his legs at 31. He came to the workshop every other Saturday, not because he needed the charity, his words, not mine, but because it was the one place in Maple Hollow where people worked on things together and nobody asked him to be grateful for it. Vivian had treated him like a data point. That was the thing I carried the whole drive home. When I pulled up to the workshop, 2 sheriff's units were already there. The containment lock had been reset from outside using the override key I'd left on file with the department when the system was installed, a detail that would matter later, because it meant law enforcement had independent confirmation the system was legitimate, documented, and properly registered before any of this happened. Vivian was standing outside the side entrance, not in handcuffs yet, arms crossed, the particular expression of someone who's been caught completely but hasn't decided to stop performing. The moment she saw me, she pointed. She told the nearest deputy that I had set a trap, that I'd illegally imprisoned her, that the lock system was a deliberate device designed to detain people without due process, and that she intended to file a complaint against me and against the department for failing to act on her 911 call promptly. She said all of it loudly, in the tone of someone used to volume-producing results. The deputy, his name was Colton, I learned later, waited for her to finish. Then he reached into the back of his unit and held up the bolt cutters. "These yours?" She said she'd brought them to document a public safety hazard. He asked how bolt cutters constituted documentation equipment. She said she needed access to gather evidence. He asked if she had a court order authorizing that access. She said she didn't need one. She was the HOA president, with authority over community compliance matters. Deputy Colton looked at her for a moment, then turned to his partner, who was running the footage on a department tablet connected to my security system's cloud account, access I'd pre-authorized with the department 3 weeks earlier, in writing, specifically for this contingency. The partner turned the tablet around. The footage played from 5:42 a.m., Vivian approaching, Vivian cutting the lock, Vivian entering, the door closing, the containment system engaging, then 11 minutes that included, in unambiguous sequence, a shelf swept to the floor, a tool cart kicked over, a sign-in sheet torn in half, an extension light shattered against the wall. You could watch the confidence leave her face in real time. Deputy Colton placed her under arrest for criminal trespassing, breaking and entering, vandalism, and property damage. He read her rights clearly and slowly, the way you do when you want everything on record without question. She didn't speak. She looked at the ground. I stood by my truck and watched. Then I went inside to assess the damage, but that wasn't where it ended. That was where it opened. When deputies began processing the scene and running standard background checks as part of the arrest documentation, one of them, cross-referencing Vivian's name against the county complaint system, flagged something that didn't match. 2 formal complaints submitted to the county assessor's office over the past 18 months carried signatures from HOA board members who, when contacted the following week, stated they had never signed those documents. The signatures were forged. The county opened a separate investigation, requesting the full HOA financial records to establish the scope of Vivian's administrative authority. A forensic accountant was brought in. The audit took 3 weeks. What it found was this. Over roughly 4 years, Vivian had authorized payments from the HOA operating account to 3 vendors, including Harlan Compliance Group, the contractor she'd hired to photograph my property, without board approval, without line-item budget authorization, and in several cases, without any documented service delivery at all. The total came to just over $41,000. Diane called me when the audit results were filed. "Danielle, you need to understand what happened here," she said. "She didn't just trespass. She broke into your workshop, got herself arrested on camera, and that arrest triggered a records pull that unraveled 4 years of financial misconduct nobody ever had a reason to look for. I sat with that for a long moment. She'd come to my workshop to find evidence of an illegal operation. She found a locked door instead, and the locked door found everything else. At the county hearing 6 weeks later, I submitted the complete documentation package. I want to walk through what that looked like, because this is the part Vivian never saw coming. Not the individual pieces, but the weight of all of them assembled in order. The timeline ran to 44 entries. It began with the first parking complaint, dated, complaint number recorded. It moved through every inspector visit, every non-finding, every county filing. It included the interior measurements from the Doyle Marsh letter, cross-referenced against the date the cameras confirmed unauthorized access to my property. It included Nora's written statement, dated and signed. It included the Harlan compliance footage, time-stamped, audio confirmed. It included Vivian's public statement from the November meeting, transcribed verbatim, her exact words. I don't need Ms. Hart's permission to document what's happening on that property. Then it included the morning of the break-in, all of it, every camera angle, every timestamp, the bolt cutters, the door, the containment lock engaging, the vandalism, the first 911 call that was hung up, the second that wasn't, 12 acts of property destruction cataloged individually with footage references. And at the end of the timeline, the forged signatures, the unauthorized expenditures, the 4-year pattern of financial misconduct that the arrest had made visible. I presented it without commentary. I laid it on the table in the order it happened and let it speak. The hearing officer looked at it for a long time. Then she looked at Vivian's attorney. The attorney asked for a recess. When they came back, he indicated his client was prepared to discuss a resolution. I looked across the table at Vivian Marsh for the last time. She was looking at the documents, not at me, at the 44 entries, at 6 months of her own actions arranged in sequence, each one leading to the next, laid out so cleanly there was no longer any version of events in which she was anything other than the author of every consequence she was now facing. I said one thing. You had the workshop's address for 6 months. You never once knocked on the door. Then I let the process finish. 6 months after that hearing, Vivian Marsh accepted a plea deal. She resigned from the HOA board as a condition of the agreement. She paid full restitution, the $41,000 in unauthorized expenditures, plus damages for the workshop repairs. She lost her real estate license, revoked by the state licensing board following the fraud findings. And she moved out of Maple Hollow before sentencing was finalized, quietly, without a farewell post in the neighborhood group or a for sale sign that lasted more than a week. Richard Doyle resigned from the board 2 months before her, citing personal reasons. Carol Simmons issued a written apology to the HOA membership. Harlan Compliance Group refunded their invoices and quietly ended their contract with the association. The HOA elected 3 new board members that March. Nora ran. She won by a margin that was, by Maple Hollow standards, not close. The workshop opened the Saturday after the arrest, right on schedule. I didn't make an announcement. I unlocked the doors at 7, put the coffee on, and waited. Walter arrived first, the way he always did, with a thermos of his own coffee because he claimed mine wasn't strong enough. Marcus came at 7:30. Dorothy came at 8, with her granddaughter visiting from out of state, wanting to see the place she'd heard about. By 9, there were 11 people in the workshop and 4 repairs underway. The new sign-in sheet filled up by noon. I didn't tell most of them what had happened that December morning. A few already knew. Maple Hollow is a small town, and small towns move information efficiently. Marcus found out through the department grapevine and called me the day after the arrest. He didn't say much, just good. One word, quietly delivered, that carried more weight than a paragraph would have. The workshop is still running every Saturday. 7 in the morning, coffee on, doors open. The smell of machine oil and sawdust and whatever someone brought in a foil-covered dish. The repaired wheelchairs still roll out the front door. The veterans still gather around the workbenches. And the padlock on the side entrance, a new one, hardened steel, same model as before, is the only thing I replaced that I didn't need to document. Some things you just replace because they're yours. The most complete justice isn't the kind you deliver. It's the kind a person builds for themselves, one unchecked decision at a time, until the whole structure finally holds their name. But here's what this story was never really about. It wasn't about a workshop. It wasn't about parking complaints or zoning classifications. Those were just the instruments. It was about what happens when someone confuses a title with ownership. Vivian Marsh didn't start out as a person who forged signatures and misused $40,000. Nobody starts there. She started as someone who genuinely believed her position gave her the right to decide what a neighborhood should look like and who it was allowed to serve. One small overstep, then another. And at some point, the line between enforcing rules and owning the people around you disappears so gradually, the person crossing it stops being able to see it at all. What she never accounted for was the other side of that pattern. The person who doesn't react, who doesn't escalate, who just writes it down, dates it, files it, and builds the record one entry at a time, while the other person keeps talking, keeps filing, keeps making moves that feel like power and are actually just evidence. I didn't win because I was louder or smarter or luckier. I won because silence isn't the same as surrender, and documentation isn't the same as patience. It's a weapon, the cleanest one there is. A documented record doesn't depend on who people believed in the moment. It depends on what actually happened. And what actually happened doesn't change. Most people have met someone like Vivian. Maybe not in an HOA, maybe at work, in a family, on a school board. Someone with just enough authority to make life difficult, and just enough confidence to believe nobody would ever read the fine print closely enough to catch them. The most important moment in this story wasn't the arrest. It was the folder, the one labeled Marsh, started the day of the first parking complaint, grown to 68 documents over 6 months, never threatened with, just kept clean, dated, and ready. That folder was the whole story. Everything else was just Vivian walking toward it.